military analyst and retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Thanks so much for coming into the studio. We heard from Jerome there about a new breakthrough, Ukrainian forces crossing a major river into the south of Ukraine, pushing back Russian forces around it. How much difference is that going to make? How much does that matter?
Unfortunately, probably very little. I mean, the main focus of the Ukrainian counteroffensive is to the east of Zaporizhzhia. If you remember, as was covered, the Kharkovka dam, when it was blown, almost certainly was to stop the Dnipro River being used as a crossing point. It protected hundreds of miles of flank to the west of Russians' flank, therefore to the east of Zaporizhzhia, which is where the trenches, the dragon's teeth, these 1 metre high obstacles for tanks and these minefields, that's where the main focus of Ukraine's counteroffensive has been. There are efforts to try and cross the Dnipro. There's also efforts around Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are mounting drone attacks on Moscow. They're doing a lot of things, but in some respects, that's all a sideshow to the main effort, which is you've got to get a significant breakthrough that front line. The Dnipro River, whilst they have made a crossing point, so we understand, my understanding it's a relatively small number of people, and it will be pretty simple for the Russians at this stage to push them back out again. It's an important initiative, but it's probably not a breakthrough and certainly not decisive.
And so we have a lot of Western military equipment in play there, British tanks and cruise missiles. But it sounds like they can't actually be exploited to their full potential at the moment.
One of the issues is that, if you remember back in September last year, the Ukrainians mounted a surprise counterattack in the north and took something like 12,000 square kilometres of land in a matter of days. And there was almost an expectation that, given the weapons, Zelensky would be able to do the same in this spring offensive. The problem was he needed the West's help to do that. Once he appealed for that help, it took several weeks, nay months, to deliver the tanks, to get the train, to get the ammunition. And it didn't take a rocket science to work out roughly where that attack was going to fall. The Russians were able to dig their defensive lines, and now the Ukrainians find themselves with a very different challenge. OK, so the momentum was lost. And we've had this recurring problem of this 3-monthly cycle of Ukraine going to the West effectively with a begging bowl and say, well, can we have some more, please? And there's been lots of criticism that, well, why does this have to happen? Why do we have to sort of be dragged to the table when we know that eventually we'll give them what they want? Well, I think it's a great question. It relates, I think, when we look from the forward position, when we look back, could we have been quicker? One of the challenges, I think, is that there is an argument that says Ukraine could not have been better prepared for this spring offensive. The shopping list was met. The West provided the weapons, the ammunition, the training and the finance. And then it's got to be in Ukraine's hands to do the breakthrough. Now, that is not... The Ukrainians are doing an amazing job. They're incredibly brave, courageous, determined fighters. But they're up against a Goliath of Russia with well-prepared defences. And to date, we're now 9 weeks into that spring offensive, it doesn't appear that there's any significant breakthrough as yet.
Because sometimes that's just the way war goes. You know, you can wish for it, but that's not necessarily going to happen. And, of course, Russia had a lot of time to prepare those defences. In the last month or two, though, we've seen an interesting change in tactics with these drone attacks on Moscow. And Russian ships are being hit as well. And yesterday, this huge military plant exploding. Is this a new phase in the war?
There are a couple of ways of winning a battle. One can be won on the battlefield, just fighting, slugging it out. The trouble is, once Ukraine gets dragged into a war of attrition, generally the larger body wins a war of attrition, and that is Russia. Another way of winning the battle is to actually erode your enemy's will to fight. And here, the will is all around President Putin. So if somehow you can undermine President Putin's position, he spreads a network of lies, he controls the media, so the Moscow public, the Moscow elite don't really know what's going on. If President Zelensky can take the fight to him, you saw the explosion in the middle of Moscow's financial district. Just imagine that was the Shard here in London. That would attract our attention in London, wouldn't it? That would suddenly get people asking questions. So strategically, President Zelensky will never do any significant damage with those drones. They're old, not many are going to get through. But he is sending a very powerful message and gradually eroding the support of Putin. And that's probably why that second front has been opened up.
Now, there's the Sun's Inside Pages have Jerome's report on it, and he talks about the hospitals there, the hero medics saving lives on Ukraine's front line. And there was a report that a report of the report that I saw today, produced by a number of Ukrainian and international organisations, that suggests that Russia is deliberately targeting healthcare facilities, infrastructure and personnel, and has hit them something like twice a week since the war began, and that it's deliberate, which sounds like a potential war crime.
The danger is when we're sat here in a warm studio, it's very difficult to judge what's actually going on the battlefield. And we've got to be quite careful. There's an information war going on here. As a former military guy who spent a lot of time on operations, I spent 2 years of my life in Afghanistan. I struggle to see why the Russian military would benefit from targeting schools or hospitals. However, what the Ukrainians are very effective at doing, the Ukrainians have actually got a great deal of Western aid. They've got lots of air defence systems, air defence rockets. They are taking down most of the Russian missiles and nearly all of the drones. Now, when they take them down, they fall pretty close to where they've been shot down. And most of them explode when they hit the ground. So it's not only debris, but there's also a lot of carnage that's caused. Now, it's quite possible. I am not in a position to know, but I think we've got to be really careful before we start labelling this as war crimes, because most of these missiles are not hitting their intended target. They're being shot down before they get there.
OK, let's bring today's panel back into this conversation. Dr. Tessa Dunlop, as Lord Ed Vaizey informed us a little earlier, is with us, broadcaster and author. And Ed Vaizey, former Conservative minister, is here. Join the conversation. Questions for the former Air Vice Marshal?
Well, I mean, I think what's happening in... it does take you back to World War I, bizarrely, despite the modern and sophisticated technology that is now in use on the battlefield. If one side chooses to put in place defensive positions and has time to do so, breaking through, particularly without air cover, is extraordinarily difficult. And it seems to me that the only breakthrough that Ukraine is likely to make will be the collapse of the Russian regime. And if Putin can continue to hold on, then this could be a stalemate for years. But cracks have appeared, the famous Wagner push on Moscow. Nobody quite knows what's happening with the Wagner mercenaries. Are they in Belarus? Are they out of Belarus? The nuclear question is raised again and again. The role of Belarus is raised again and again. A possible Russian incursion into Baltic states or even Poland is an issue. And all of these are playing out in a very complex way away from this main battlefield.
But in a sense, it always feels to me that Ukraine has to win the war and all Russia has to do is not lose it.
Yeah,
and I don't see how they can ever get around that, Ukraine. It's a real problem, isn't it?
I struggle with the concept of win, though, because I don't know what winning means at this stage. If you look at what President Putin's objectives probably are, is to subjugate the whole of Ukraine, that looks extremely unlikely to be able to achieve. He also wanted to stop the expansion of NATO. He's failed with that. He's wanted to make Russia great. Their economy is collapsing or whatever. But for President Zelensky, what does good look like for him? He's made very clear, I want to expunge from my country all of the Russians. If you look at Crimea and you look at the east of the Donbass, most military experts think that will be very, very difficult to do. So winning starts to lose context here. What probably this will end up, as a lot of conflicts do, is horrible compromise, which President Zelensky has to lead on, may involve some ceding of territory, will certainly require some sort of security guarantees. And in 1994, the Budapest memo, when Russia provided an absolute pledge to look after Ukraine's sovereignty once they gave up their nuclear weapons, that was ripped up 20 years later. So that's going to involve some international support. And finally, it's going to be money. And Germany was rebuilt up.
I think the point is that the politics of what is happening between Ukraine and Russia are going to be more important, I think, than the battlefield, because the battlefield, the counteroffensive was built up as this potential for Ukraine to break through because the Russians have been so comprehensively defeated in their attempt to evade Ukraine. But think about all the issues that are bubbling up. There is a serious move to get Ukraine into the European Union. It's obviously not going to happen overnight, but the mindset has changed. A serious thinking about getting Ukraine into NATO in the future, not going to happen overnight. And the other thing is, of course, a Trump presidency could change everything.
Listen, this was something I wanted to come on to. We don't have time, but thank you so much for talking us through this. I think it's important to keep it to keep the war high up the news agenda. Retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, thank you.